my pleasure to welcome Professor William Desmond to this short interview about the conference that we are putting on here at St. Mary's Seminary University in Baltimore in May of 2027. The title of the conference is Revelation and Finitude, William Desmond and Emanuel Falk in Dialogue. So we're very much looking forward to this event, and as I think many of the viewers will know, William and I have been in deep collaboration for many years now. When I was at St. Patrick's Pontifical University in Maynooth, Ireland, I invited him there to be the inaugural lecturer of the lecture series on Christian philosophy, and that was put on in tandem with the Future of Christian Thinking event, and he was there for a couple other events that I invited him to. And it's very special for me to be able to invite him to Baltimore, which is something of a homecoming because William was at Baltimore Loyola for many years. And this is the first time that I've ever been able to put on an event in collaboration with my colleague Barnabas Asprey, specifically on William's thought in relation to Emanuel Falk. And so it's an honor for us to be able to do that, and we're very much looking forward to it. So William, just curious, what you're most curious about in relation to dialoguing with Emanuel Falk's work. Where do you see perhaps some overlap and also areas of disagreement? So Dr. Asprey did the interview with Emanuel last week, and Emanuel described what he thinks it's going to be as one of the titles of one of his book is The Loving Struggle. And so he sees the dialogue with you as one of a loving struggle.
Right. Well, I hope it's not a Heideggerian struggle where you feel the need of an enemy, because I struggle against that, if that's not too paradoxical, I think, to say. Well, I think I'm of course struck by the metaphor that I'm interested, of course, in the relationship between philosophy and theology, philosophy and religion, always have been. But the striking metaphor that Falk uses in terms of crossing the Rubicon, this is just an area of intrigue to tease out a little bit more what might be involved in crossing. Crossing a Rubicon has connotations which are bound up with imperial conquest and civil war. And whereas I talk about crossing, and more so in recent years perhaps than earlier, crossing the between, or betweening itself as a kind of a crossing. So a crossing between philosophy and theology, religion, what's the nature of that crossing? And so there's obviously an overlap between us, in the sense that his own crossing is an act of spiritual daring and courage in not allowing a simple model of parallel lines. But again, what happens in the between space is all important. And so I think that we obviously come out of a shared Catholic ethos, qua religion, but in relation to what philosophy gets articulated, I think the phenomenological heritage of Falk himself raises issues for me. Now, again, I'm in an exploratory mode at the moment, trying to get a sense of the richness and complexity and nuance of Emanuel Falk's work. So I'm still, but I do sense very strongly a certain almost standard Catholicism from the point of view of the separation and relation of philosophy and religion, and also the kind of hinterlands of phenomenological influences, and not least hiding somewhere behind the shadows the figure of Heidegger in relation to metaphysics and phenomenology. I want a dialogue on that score will be very illuminating for me, but I think it's also very relevant to the nature of standard phenomenology in the 20th century, 21st century.
Yes, absolutely. So in the interview, which you haven't seen yet, but one of the issues that Falk raises is he wonders what the place is for phenomenology in your work. and he also thinks that he is returning to a kind of metaphysics now with his work, and so he's not as anti-metaphysical as certain French Catholic phenomenologists. So there is some nuance there, but he also did mention that for you, the looming figure seems to be Hegel, and for him it is Heidegger. So there's no doubt that Heidegger and the heritage of how one is negotiating the phenomenological heritage is going to be part of the discussion.
Well, I mean, in an obvious sense, I've engaged with Hegelian dialectic all my career, but I think more deeply influential is a kind of spirit of Augustinian crossing. I mean, the thing that has always attracted me about Augustine is the kind of fluidity of his intellectual adventure, his venturing that doesn't want to academically find its seat in one department or another department. He's a restless thinker, but he's also a dynamic thinker, crossing boundaries that have been fixed, particularly since the time of scholasticism, in a manner that isn't always good. It's not good for philosophy. I think in the long run, it's not good for theology in the long run. So I would say the kind of fluid dialectic or metaxology of a Platonic Augustinianism is a more positive groundswell of inspiration, whereas Hegel's dominating speculative dialectic and its offshoots is a challenge in modernity and postmodernity. So there are different strands, different dimensions to. I don't think Hegelianism in the French context, and again, this is something that we can talk about in situ. It was so dominated in the 20th century by the Kojevian interpretation. And a Kojevian interpretation is Kojev, fair enough.
Yes.
It's a version of Hegelianism, and it's an atheistic version of Hegelianism. So there's so many issues there. But the revolt against Hegelianism, whether Marxist or Kojevian or whatever, that shaped the kind of the milieu of philosophy in France in a manner that I never felt under the influence of that, quite frankly, and I hope that gave me a freedom to just think about things in a more elementally Augustinian modality.
Yes, no, absolutely. There's going to be, you're both coming out of the continental tradition, but you're not coming out of it from the same area. So it'll be very interesting to see how the conversation develops.
Yeah.
So interestingly enough, one of the things that Falk mentioned in his interview was that he's a thinker of finitude,
Yeah.
and that there's no between in his thought, in the sense of a between humanity and God, because everything comes from Christian revelation in terms of a between. So he described that he actually thinks that you're coming out of a more Platonic, you just mentioned Augustine, but you're coming out of a more Platonic ethos, and that he's turning to more Aristotelian ethos of contingency. And even though he did his earlier work on Bonaventure, which is definitely in the Augustinian lineage, he sees himself as kind of becoming more Thomistic as he's gone along, insofar as he's trying to open up a dialogue with humanity on the basis of, without any presuppositions of Christian revelation.
Yeah. Well, I guess I find it difficult to situate myself in that way of stating things, quite frankly, First of all, I don't think that whatever Platonism is in the interpretation throughout the history, it doesn't do justice to the sense of lived being in the midst of things that the Platonic dialogue communicates. These are just human beings talking to each other in the agora about the ultimate questions. There's no two-world practice of philosophizing. It's thoughtful human beings talking about the most important things. And that's what dialogein is. This is conversation. And again, I don't myself find it. I'm not at home with juxtaposing the Aristotelian and the Platonic, because they come out of the same school or ethos also, and there's so much in Aristotle that is extraordinarily rich suggestive. The style of philosophizing, certainly from the point of view of the mixture of the poetic and the systematic in Plato, is very attractive to me. But I'm a systematic thinker also, so I can mix it with the Aristotelian metaphysicians without too much difficulty. But again, on the Thomistic thing, I mean, I've written sympathetically about analogy, and it's in the same family as what I call the hyperboles of being, the metaphor, analogy, symbol, and hyperbole. So I'm deeply attentive to the nuances of analogy that actually have been often frozen into formulae by some traditional formulations. I mean, again, our colleague and friend John Betts, I can call on him for a reference of character on the analogical score, since he sees Eric Chavara being reborn in some of the things that I'm saying, which is, again, yes. I'm quite happy to be reborn in that form, to be sure.
Yes.
So it's these are conversations which, in the human presence with the other, will, I think, work their way out, I hope, in illuminating. And one thing I should say, and I mentioned this about crossing the Rubicon there earlier on, the relation of philosophy and theology. I would also at some point like to talk about this notion of a companioning relation, which I don't think fits into any of the standard models that have come down to us from the ancient world and the medievals and the modern stress on autonomy and so on, And I think what I call companioning is, again, closer to this Augustinian fluidity between the philosophical and the religious. What Emmanuel Falk means by between, I don't know, but it's quite clear that the between isn't some static space. And I've often been asked that question, between what and what, as if they were just two terms and then you kind of juggled between the two. But that's not what's at stake in the notion of the metaxou at all. And more in more recent years, I've been making a verb of the word between, a betweening, rather than just simply the between. So there's, again, much to be talked about there of, I think, mutual illumination, and I probably the practice of philosophizing, it falls differently in the end, I think.
Yes. Now, of course, the title of the conference is Revelation and Finitude. Right. It's not Revelation and the Between. Maybe it should have been Revelation and Finitude and the Between. But how do you see, or how do you negotiate such things as revelation and finitude within your own work? Of course, you have your recent work on godsends.
Godsends, right. From default atheism to the surprise of revelation. But just on finitude first, again, I have actually addressed in a number of places what is said to be the philosophy of finitude and nothing but finitude after Hegel. And I articulate a number of different responses to the relationship between the finite and what is more than the finite in a number of different places. So again, one of the shadows hanging over that, of course, will always be Hegel's dialectical sublation of finitude into infinity. But I present quite a different understanding of it. But I also give tools, so to say, to understand the turn to so-called finitude after Hegel. But I think that turn to finitude and nothing but finitude, it's ultimately incoherent. The deepest investigation of finitude shows that something is at work in finitude that can't be accounted for in fully finite terms. So again, that doesn't lead to a Hegelian sublation, but it opens a space of consideration where there's no flight from finitude in the efforts to think the meaning of infinitude. And as I say, in multiple places and things that I've written about in relation to Pascal, for instance, Hegel himself, Marx, Nietzsche, Heidegger himself. I've addressed this in Is There a Sabbath for Thought? Heidegger's, I see it as a kind of postulatory finitism that actually doesn't do justice to finitude, because when it hits a certain threshold, it always wants to bounce back down into immanence. And I think that's actually untrue to finitude and the restlessness of the philosophical spirit as actually, there's a porosity to finitude itself that can't be included in standard rhetorics of philosophies of finitude. But revelation, yeah. I think that my engagement with revelation is kind of sideways in a certain sense. If I was to speak theologically, for a good part, it's, if you like, special revelation, as opposed to not special, rather general revelation. Yeah. So in that sense, it's deeply philosophical, and I do think that part of what I've been doing is a kind of a philosophical apostolate to the atheists since Hegel, in renewing a sense of the sacredness of being and the givenness of what is, as itself charged with a kind of theophanous promise that a philosopher has to be hospitable to, in my terms. But I think those who know my work will know that there's a companioning of Christianity in what I've been doing. Again, just given the kind of context within which it's almost impossible to talk about religion in philosophy since Hegel, and the anti-metaphysical thrust of, say, 20th century philosophy, the kind of dictatorial claim by someone like Heidegger that philosophy and Christianity is a contradiction in terms, and so on. All of these have produced a kind of asphyxiation of the betweening relation between philosophy and Christianity. And I see myself very much as, there's a companioning relation, but if I'm in the apostolate to the atheists, I have to. But again, I don't think that I'm successful, because it's a bit like Heidegger. Heidegger kind of detheologizes Kierkegaard and detheologizes Augustine, and then the theologians, they catch a little perfume of the banished gods, and then they rush towards the empty, exiled place, and Heidegger will just say that being is not God, and so on. I kind of invert that in a certain sense, that when I talk about being, that those signs of sacrality are more true to what shows itself, it seems to me, or at least the philosopher should open himself towards the fullness of what shows itself. But the notion of special revelation, if I can use that kind of locution, I don't see an absolute rupture between creation and incarnation, if I could put it that way. The goodness of being given to be at all in creation, the perplexing mystery of the fall from that original goodness, the communication of divinity in incarnate form, and what that betokens for the transformation of time itself. The latter themes are coming more in the things that I've written in more recent years. That conference that was in Minute there on eschatology, I sent off a copy of a piece called On the Edge, which is reflections on teleology and eschatology, but this notion of an edge being double-sided and trying to talk of the other side of the edge. The edge is a cut, but also eschaton as meaning edge, and so on. So I have been moving a bit more explicitly into terms that those who are theologically educated should see what's going on. Philosophers generally are quite hopeless on that particular score. So, but I do the best I can on that particular score. But God sends is an effort to, as it were, approach revelation somewhat indirectly I mean, I know that the atheistic philosophers just they smell God and they don't want to go near it. Okay, what can I do? And then some more kind of card-carrying theologians will want me to kind of give verse and chapter and verse from Scripture and so on. But I have a particular voice that I think tries to at least concretize something of this companioning. And the companion doesn't always have to be foregrounded. You don't have to always talk about what you love most to communicate what your deepest love is. It's often by an intimacy and intimation that gets communicated in our time of silence about these things in philosophy.
Yes. Okay. Very well said. So my last question, but to lead into my last question, there's no doubt that I think one of the talking points will be in bringing you and Emmanuel together is that I think if we want to put it this way, it is helpful to say that you approach revelation from a more general revelation and Falk from a more special revelation. But how do you see the theme of the conference, Revelation and Finitude, and the fact that we're bringing together, I think one doesn't have to argue for the fact that both you and Emmanuel are two of the most influential continental philosophers of religion writing today, but continental philosophers that are coming, as we've already touched upon, from different spaces. And it's not often that continental philosophers from different spaces actually come together and converse about important issues in continental philosophy. So how do you see this event speaking to the future of continental philosophy of religion and or philosophical theology?
Well, again, the theme Revelation and Finitude is very appropriate in the following sense, I think. I certainly think of my work as a philosophy of finitude, but how one understands finitude is the difficult question, and whether the framing of finitude as a framing of immanence, as it has been so dominantly in continental philosophy, that's something that I think is to be... I reject it, in fact. I don't think that there's any immanent frame that can be closed in on itself. I think the so-called immanent frame is perforated. It's porous. It's not the way to go about things, and I can see that Falk doesn't do that at all. But he's struggling with this question in the terms that he brings to the issue. But I think you can actually... I talk about philosophizing in the midst of things, where there is a certain need to return to the most elemental things in the human condition. And the extraordinary character about special revelation, if you want to speak in those terms, is that it speaks to those absolutely elemental dimensions. They're not dimensions, it is our being, incarnate creatures, perplexingly, mysteriously, joyfully reaching and being reached by something that is not to be simply included in the grammar of finite entities. So revelation and finitude are very much bound up with each other, provided we have the resources philosophically and theologically to see finitude itself as theophanous, or the promise of theophany. So now, how to make that into a program, I don't really know. I mean, I know that phenomenology has been successful because it has kind of constituted a kind of a school, and certain attitudes can be passed on from master to teacher and so on, and evident, for instance, in the relationship between Mary and Falk, just to take that as one example, teacher and student. I do think a more kind of almost denuded philosophizing, a naked philosophizing, a poverty of philosophy that is also willing to just go outside of the schools, as it were, a kind of docta ignorantia of a certain sort, in which we acknowledge who we are as honestly as we possibly can, and discover that we're creatures defined by this elemental constitutive porosity to the divine. But how to put that in? I don't know if you can put it into a program, but I hope that I've written enough to give people signs how they might find direction in the midst of things. But whether that can be made more compatible with school formalization, I'm not quite sure. In strange ways, it's a kind of recurrence of the issue of nihilism in modernity. Nihilism recurring now, after nihilism almost. If you see someone like Nietzsche as nihilism after the so-called death of God, we're nihilistic now, having known that nihilism actually just leads to nothing. And either a way back or a way forward means, in some sense, coming to terms with what is most ontologically elemental and constitutive about our own being, about being as a whole, about the source of all being, about divine being, and so on. So I talk about the idiocy of being, but there's a certain singular character to the philosophical search that just resists complete systematization, and that doesn't help anyone. But I think it's at the core of this porosity of the human being to the divine also.
Well, William, thank you as usual. Very eloquent words. We're deeply looking forward to welcoming you and Emmanuel next May. And I thank you for the time today. And I encourage all the viewers to sign up for this wonderful event. Thank you, William.
Well, I'm looking forward to it very much. And thank you also for our conversation. Very serious conversation today. So I hope in Baltimore we can have a bit of fun also.
We must, yeah, definitely drink a little bit. All right.